Okay, so let's wrap this up. I'm going to actually do another paragraph. We're almost done with this. He says the answer must be that the poet. Actually, I'm not going to talk about that now. So let's talk about Clint Brooks. So the a classic thing that Clint Brooks does is he says what you should be doing in your work is talking about what the poem actually does, what the artwork is actually doing. A classic example that comes up is students will often ask this question. So one of the most common questions I get as a teacher is, "Did Shakespeare really intend?" Like I'll be like, what Shakespeare's doing here?" And people go, "Does Shakespeare really mean that? Like, do you think he meant to put that in the poem, or are we just like over?" Students are always worried that I'm over analyzing. They always think that I'm saying like, "Did Shakespeare really mean that grave scene to have all that symbolism in it?" When just they're telling jokes and being stupid, and I make this big deal out of the fact that digging graves goes back to Adam, and that the houses last until doomsday. And then I make this point about how what Shakespeare is doing is making it so that the gentlemen are sort of they're the fancy families they were created a long time ago and will be around a long time in the future. But the grave diggers with those two jokes about Adam and Eve and the end of the world are actually suggesting that the grave diggers are the bigger presence. Um, did Shakespeare really mean that? Students say. You see how that's a question about authors, which is why Clint Brooks is in the author section? Because did Shakespeare really mean it? Did he really intend it? And with Wordsworth, you do want to ask those questions, right? What is the author's meaning? What is the author's emotion that he's able to kind of create here? With Wordsworth, we ask, what is the emotion the author is expressing? Clint Brooks says, I don't give a shit what the author intended. I am not here to talk about what the author meant. I am not here to talk about what the author felt. Clint Brooks says, what I'm here to do, Clint Brooks says, I reject the author as a concept. He says, let's not talk about that. What I'm here to do is not to talk about biography or history or philosophy. I'm just going to tell you what the words on the page do. I had an example recently of a student who wanted to write a paper on Wally. And the student asked me, we were discussing whether Wally seems like it's about the environment, right? Because human beings have treated in Wally, you can see that the Earth has been treated like a garbage can, and it's just trash everywhere. And the student said I was going to write a paper about how this is related to environmentalism. And I thought that was a great idea for a paper. And then the student came to me. I think I've already told this story, but this is a different context, and I think it works again. The student said, "Oh, this is very sad because it turns out that in an interview with the director of the movie, he said that's not what they were trying to do." Well, the author can say whatever he wants, but if I'm looking at that movie, I'm pretty sure that movie's about environmentalism. And with Clint Brooks, he doesn't want you to care about what the author even says. The author doesn't get to say. The author writes the poem, and then our job is to talk about what the poem does, not what the author meant, what the words on the page do, how the images work. And I'm going to give you a big example with Hamlet in a bit, probably in a couple of days. But the point is that we don't. Clint Brooks doesn't care about authors. He cares about authors so little that when he was an English teacher, um, students were real into Wordsworth, and they loved to talk about the emotions that the author was expressing in the poem and how it linked to the biography. So they loved to talk about, well, the author got dumped, and so he wrote a poem about love and somebody getting dumped, and it's an expression of that emotion. Fine. What Clint Brooks does to drive his students up the wall, and it really cracked me up. What Clint Brooks used to do in the 40s is he'd say, "Oh, welcome to English class, everybody," and he would hand out a poem. And he's, "Okay, let's analyze this poem, guys. Let's look at this." And then he'd give them all a copy of the poem. And the students would say, "Professor, who wrote this poem? There's no name on it." And Clint Brooks would say, "I don't care. I'm not going to tell you the author's name because we're not here to talk about the author. We're here to talk about the words on the page and how they work." Um, it's fascinating. He literally wouldn't tell his students. Now, of course, nowadays you just Google it. But he wouldn't tell his students who wrote the poems they were analyzing in class because he felt that when you have the author's name, you get distracted because you end up talking about the author and not about the work of art, because he feels like Wordsworth has done a great deal of damage to literature, because through Wordsworth we end up spending all our time talking about what the author meant and very little time talking about how the work of art works. And he feels like this is a fucking disaster. And that's why I put him in the art and authors unit, is because he's in conversation. The subject, art and authors, that's the conversation he's a big, big, big part of. Before I get the other thing about Brooks that's really important is Brooks is very powerful and important. in the college classroom today for a very stupid reason. Um, eh, when you see me, I don't know how to put this. Okay, so Clint Brooks is really important in the college classroom, all the college classrooms across America, really all over the place, because Clint Brooks' idea that we shouldn't talk about history or philosophy or psychology, but we should just talk about the words on the page is great for college classrooms. Because my students, and I don't just mean my students, but everybody's students, you walk into a classroom, I don't know what you guys know about history. I mean, I have recent Chinese immigrants. They don't know anything about the history of American slavery in the 19th century. If I start talking about that stuff, I'm going to lose everybody. Um, and so Clint Brooks is extra powerful because teachers have been teaching the Clint Brooks way forever, since the 40s. Why? Because he's perfect for a college classroom. Because if you're just talking about the words on the page, that's a great way to talk about how a poem works with students without needing them to do a pile of fucking research. Um, and so most teachers, they put the poem on the board and they talk about the metaphors and how the poem works. So Clint Brooks is really a major part of sort of the college. When you talk about literature in a college classroom setting, Clint Brooks is a huge part. Because if I give you guys a poem by Wordsworth, I can't expect any of you to have researched Wordsworth's life enough to know what he was going through when he wrote the poem. And so Clint Brooks is dominant because he's so easy to, this method is so easy to teach. You just put the poem on the board and everybody talks about it and everybody goes home. It's great. Whereas the other methods, the history, the biography, the philosophy, the psychology, require students to be trained in all of these other areas that they might not have training. They may not, maybe they don't know about history. Every time I give you a poet, you have to know about the time and place he came from. Students don't know that. I can't pick up some medieval Italian poet. How much do you really know about medieval Italian whatever? And I don't have time to teach it. And so Clint Brooks really gets this powerful, he really took over the way the academy teaches poems is coming directly out of Clint Brooks. All right. Just to wrap up, Clint Brooks says, the answer must be that the poet himself obviously did not, or else he would not have to write his poem, right? So he says, cannot we as readers frame such a proposition? Isn't there a way to say what the poem meant? Actually, I'm going to put this in my own words. I don't like the way it's said there. Students are often, this is actually, I'm going to go over this because it's actually a classic student question. He says, isn't there a way, in this paragraph, he says, isn't it possible to frame a proposition, a statement, which will adequately represent the total meaning of the poem? And then he says down here, the answer must be the poet himself obviously did not. It's not possible to do that. Why? Or else he would not have had to write his poem. I love that idea so much. He says that, because students often will read a poem or a short story and it's complicated and they have to do all this work to understand it. And they go, could Shakespeare have put this in easier terms? And the answer is no, he could not have. Otherwise, he would have. Have you ever tried to describe something and you've had a heart like where you don't have the words for it, it's very difficult to describe? That's essentially what great art does, is it tries to put words to experiences that there are no words for. And that is why it's difficult. One of my favorite writers said, art is not difficult because it is trying to be difficult, but because it is trying to be art. If these people could have said it in a simpler way, they would have. Actually, I'll give you a classic sense. David Lynch, my favorite director, take the film class with me. It's an entire class based around David Lynch. And David Lynch's movies are famously hard to understand. And somebody said to David Lynch, what's your movie about? I think it was actually David Lynch's wife. They said to his wife, what are your husband's movies about? Like, can you explain it? It's so confusing. Can you explain this to me? Perfectly good question. You guys have all had this experience, right? Where you read a work of art, it's really confusing. And you're like, okay, can you explain this to me? What's it about? And she said the most interesting thing. She said, if he could say what it's about, it wouldn't be about that. If he could say what it's about, it wouldn't be about that. Because the whole point was when you're asking somebody to say it simpler, you're asking them, when you're asking somebody to say it in a simpler way, you're asking them to sort of say what it means in an easy way. But if it could be said in an easy way, we wouldn't have to write a whole poem about it. The entire point of writing the poem is to say, you say, can you put this in other words? It really can't be put in other words, because if it could be put in other words, it would be. the reason why the poem exists, how do I put this? As a way to, it's like right in the tip of my tongue, I've almost got it. Give me 10 seconds to breathe and I'm going to think of it. I've totally lost my train of thought. I've had it, it's right here, right in the tip of my tongue, I've almost got it. That the poem, I got it. When you ask somebody to put it in other words, you're asking them to say something sayable. Whereas the entire point of a work of art, it is trying to say something unsayable. That's why it's complicated. It's trying to describe something there are no words for. Shakespeare's Hamlet is trying to put words to something that words did not exist yet to describe. And so it's not, when you ask somebody to put it in other words, you're asking them to say something sayable. But if a work of art is worth anything, it's trying to say the unsayable, and that's what makes it interesting. Okay, guys, I'm going to pick this up next time with an example from Hamlet, so you can, we're going to finish the Cleanth Brooks next time, and then follow it up with a Hamlet example. Okay, cool. See you then.